There is a moment, if you have ever walked through an old barn in the American countryside, when the floorboards creak beneath your boots and something shifts under the soil. A hollow sound, a resistance that does not belong to packed earth. Most people keep walking. They assume it is a root, a rock, the natural irregularity of ground that has been walked on for 100 years. But a few people stop. They kneel down. They press their palms flat against the cold dirt and feel it. The faint outline of something deliberate, something buried with intention. What they have found, more often than anyone outside of rural America ever knew, is an iron kettle, not dropped, not forgotten, buried on purpose by hands that knew exactly what they were doing and exactly why. This is the story of those kettles, those hands, and the world that made burying them not just practical, but absolutely necessary for survival. The America of 1930 was not the America most people imagine when they picture their grandparents' era. It was not warm kitchens and radio music and neighbors waving from front porches for the farming families spread across the vast interior of this country, across the red clay hills of Georgia, the flat black soil of Illinois, the dry wheat fields of Kansas, the rocky hollows of Appalachia, the river-bottom farms of Missouri and Tennessee. 1930 was the beginning of a long emergency that nobody had a name for yet. The stock market had collapsed the previous October. Banks were failing by the hundreds. Credit, which farming families had used to buy seed and equipment in spring and pay it back after harvest in fall, was drying up. And the weather, as if in conspiracy with the economy, was turning against everything that grew. A man named Harold Beaumont, and Harold represents hundreds of men just like him, farmers whose real names are scattered across courthouse records and church ledgers and faded letters in cardboard boxes in attics from Ohio to Oklahoma. Harold Beaumont had worked his 240 acres in central Missouri since 1912. He had survived the First World War, the influenza pandemic of 1918, the agricultural depression of the early 1920s that most city people never even heard about. He had buried a son and raised 3 daughters. He knew drought, he knew debt. He knew the particular loneliness of a man standing in a field at sunset, calculating in his head whether the corn would make enough to cover what he owed before the first frost came. But 1930 was different. Harold knew it in his bones before the almanac confirmed it, before his neighbors said it out loud at the grain elevator, before the county extension agent drove out in his Ford and sat at the kitchen table with a look on his face that said the words he was about to speak were going to change things permanently. The bank in town was closing, not struggling, not reorganizing, closing. The doors would be locked by the end of the month, and every dollar that every farming family in that county had deposited, savings scraped together over years of hard harvests and dry summers and prices that never seemed to go high enough, was gone. Not reduced, not devalued, gone. Harold Beaumont walked out of that kitchen, past his wife Ruth standing at the stove, past his daughters doing their schoolwork at the table, and he went to the barn. He stood in the dim light with the smell of horses and hay and old wood around him, and he did the arithmetic one more time, the way a man does when he already knows the answer, but cannot yet accept it. He had $11.40 in his coat pocket. He had a farm. He had equipment that was wearing out and could not be replaced. He had animals that needed feed through a winter that was already showing its teeth in early November. He had a family that needed to eat. And he had, hanging on the wall of that barn and sitting on the shelves his father had built in 1904, a collection of cast iron that represented something the bank could not touch, because nobody knew it was there, and because iron, unlike paper money, could not fail. To understand why cast iron became the hidden currency of rural America during the Depression years and beyond, you have to understand what cast iron actually was to a farming family of that era. It was not cookware in the way we think of cookware today. A non-stick pan you replace every few years when the coating wears out. Cast iron was permanent. It was infrastructure. A well-seasoned Dutch oven or a large cooking kettle that had been in a family for 30 or 40 years was as valuable as a piece of furniture, as fundamental as the roof over the house. The large iron kettles, the ones we are talking about, the ones that ended up buried under barn floors across rural America, were typically between 5 and 20 gallons in capacity. They were used for everything. rendering lard in the fall after hog slaughter, making soap from wood ash lye and animal fat, washing laundry by boiling it clean, scalding hog carcasses at butchering time to loosen the bristles, brewing apple butter in October, standing over an outdoor fire for an entire day, stirring with a long wooden paddle while the whole neighborhood came together to help and share in the result. These kettles were not luxuries, they were the machinery of survival on a self-sufficient farm, and they were, by the early 1930s, becoming something else as well. They were becoming money, not in the official sense. You could not walk into a store and hand over an iron kettle and receive change. But in the practical economy of rural communities that were watching their cash economy collapse in slow motion, iron was something you could trade. Iron was something that held its value when paper did not. Iron was something that a neighbor who needed to render lard would pay for, not in dollars maybe, but in labor, or in seed, or in a side of pork, or in the kind of mutual obligation that kept communities alive when the official systems failed them. Harold Beaumont understood this. So did his wife Ruth, who in many ways understood the economics of their situation more clearly than he did, because women in farming households of that era were the ones who managed the actual daily calculus of food and supplies and what could be traded for what. Ruth had grown up watching her own mother navigate the lean years after her father's farm went under in 1921, and she had absorbed lessons about resourcefulness and concealment that went back even further. To grandmothers who had survived the aftermath of the Civil War, when armies of both sides had a habit of taking whatever iron and copper they could find for their own purposes. The tradition of burying valuables to protect them from outside seizure was not invented during the Depression. It was ancient. But it found a new urgency in the 1930s, when something that had never happened before in most living Americans' experience became terrifyingly real. The government began, in some circumstances, to come for what you had. In April of 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102, which made it illegal for most American citizens to own gold coins, gold bullion, or gold certificates above a small personal exemption. Citizens were required to deliver their gold to Federal Reserve banks in exchange for paper currency at the official rate of $20.67 per troy ounce. For farming families, this order landed like a thunderclap on a clear day. Most farming families did not have significant gold holdings. They were not wealthy people sitting on gold bars, but some had gold coins that had been passed down through generations, tucked into the back of a drawer or sewn into the lining of a coat, representing a family's last absolute reserve against total disaster. And now those coins were to be surrendered to a government that had, from the perspective of many rural Americans, already failed to protect them from the banking collapse that had wiped out their savings. The gold order was one thing, but it taught a lesson that went far beyond gold itself. It confirmed what many rural families had already begun to suspect, that anything the government knew about, the government could reach, and that the safest place to keep what you valued was somewhere the government did not know to look. The barn floor was not chosen randomly. It was chosen with the cold logic of people who had been studying their options and reaching the same conclusion independently, on farms separated by hundreds of miles, without any coordination or communication beyond the common experience of being poor, rural, and suddenly very aware of how fragile official protection really was. Harold Beaumont dug his first hole in late November of 1933. He chose a spot near the back wall of the barn, beneath the stall where his draft horse stood, because that was the spot least likely to be casually disturbed, and because the horse, Old Clem, had a personality that discouraged uninvited visitors from lingering. Ruth had wrapped the largest kettle, a 17-gallon piece that had come to them from Harold's mother, in burlap soaked in lard to slow the rusting. They lowered it into the hole at dusk, when the light made it impossible for anyone on the road to see clearly what was happening, and Harold filled in the earth and tamped it down and spread fresh straw over the disturbed ground before he came in for supper. Neither of them talked about it at the table. The daughters did not ask. In a farming household where survival depended on discretion, children learned early that some things were done and not discussed. What was in that kettle was the question that drove the practice and made it spread, because iron kettles, once buried, became containers. and what you put inside them before sealing them in the earth was a calculation as individual as a fingerprint, shaped by each family's particular fears and particular resources. Some families buried kettles containing silver coins, not great quantities, but the steady accumulation of years, quarters, and half dollars, and the occasional Morgan silver dollar that had been set aside from transactions, because silver, like iron, felt more real than paper. Some buried documents, land deeds, birth certificates, marriage records, the paperwork that proved who you were and what you owned. Because if the farmhouse burned, and farmhouses burned with terrible regularity in an era of wood stoves and kerosene lamps, those documents burned too, and a man without his deed had a very hard time proving his claim to the land he stood on. Some families buried food, not fresh food, obviously, but canned goods in sealed jars packed carefully inside the kettle with straw for cushioning, or dried beans and corn sealed in smaller iron pots nested inside the larger one. Emergency reserves that even the most desperate visitor to the farm would not find, because the visitor would look in the root cellar and the spring house and the smokehouse, not under the barn floor where the horses stood. The practice accelerated through the middle years of the Depression for a reason that had nothing to do with the government and everything to do with the neighbors. This is the part of the story that tends to surprise people who did not grow up in rural communities of that era, because the popular image of Depression-era rural America is one of solidarity. Neighbors helping neighbors. Communities pulling together. Barn raisings and shared harvests and the potluck suppers that appear in every nostalgic account of the period. And that solidarity was real. It absolutely existed. But it existed alongside something else, something that the nostalgic accounts tend to leave out, which was the quiet, grinding desperation that could turn good people into people who did things they would never have considered doing in better times. Theft on farms during the Depression years was not a minor problem. It was a sustained crisis. Livestock disappeared overnight. Not just a chicken or two, but entire flocks of hens. Hogs found with their throats cut and the best cuts taken. Horses untethered from pastures and simply gone in the morning. Equipment was stolen and sold for scrap. Smokehouse doors were pried open and winter's meat was carried away before dawn. Families who had spent the fall butchering and curing and storing against the cold winter opened their smokehouses in December to find them stripped clean. The people doing the stealing were not, for the most part, professional criminals. They were desperate people, sometimes strangers passing through, sometimes families from the next county over, who were hungrier than their pride would allow them to admit openly. Sometimes men who had lost their own farms to foreclosure and had nothing left to lose by taking from someone who still had something. Harold Beaumont knew what it was to feel that hunger. He had no contempt for desperate men, but he had a family to feed, and what was buried could not be stolen. The county extension agents who traveled the rural districts during the 30s and 40s, those underpaid government employees who were the primary link between farming families and the outside world of agricultural science and economic assistance, began to notice something peculiar in the farms they visited. Equipment that should have been visible was not. Conversations that should have been straightforward became evasive when the subject of assets and inventory came up. Farmers who were clearly surviving better than their circumstances should have allowed were vague about the sources of their resilience. The extension agents were not fools. They understood, many of them, that they were seeing the surface of a practice that ran much deeper. Most of them chose not to investigate further. They were themselves people who came from farming communities and understood the code, the understanding, never spoken but universally observed, that a man's barn was his own business, and that some questions, if you were a neighbor or a guest, you simply did not ask. Ruth Beaumont was the one who turned the buried kettle into a system. This is important because the history of this practice tends to focus on the physical act of burying and on the men who did the digging, while the organizational intelligence that made the practice truly effective was almost always female. Ruth kept a mental inventory, never written down, of exactly what was where. She knew the depth of each hole, the landmarks she used to locate each spot, the condition of each wrapped piece, and when it had last been checked. She knew which kettle held the land deed and the birth certificates in their oilskin wrapping. She knew which one held the silver. She knew which one held the seed corn that she and Harold kept as a last reserve against the possibility that one spring they would have no money to buy seed from the elevator and would need to plant from their own stock. When Harold was sick with pneumonia in the winter of 1937, sick enough that Ruth genuinely did not know for several days whether he was going to survive, she managed the buried inventory alone, checking each site after a thaw to make sure water had not infiltrated, adjusting the contents when circumstances changed. She taught her oldest daughter where each site was when that daughter turned 16, passing the knowledge on the way you pass on a recipe or a skill, quietly, practically, without drama, because it was simply something that needed to be known. The iron kettle beneath the barn floor was not unique to any one region of the country, but it took on slightly different characters in different places, shaped by local conditions and local fears. In the cotton farming communities of the Deep South, where sharecropping families, both white and black, operated on the absolute margins of survival under crop-lien systems that kept them in perpetual debt to landowners and merchants, the buried kettle was often the only asset a family possessed that was truly their own. The crop-lien system gave merchants and landowners legal claims on a sharecropper's entire harvest before a single dollar reached the family that had grown it, and on all of a tenant farmer's personal property as well, in some interpretations. Burying iron, and sometimes copper, and sometimes small amounts of currency, was one of the few ways a family in that system could accumulate anything that was genuinely beyond legal seizure. The knowledge of where the kettle was buried was treated as a matter of family survival, passed down with the same seriousness as the knowledge of where the water was or how to read the sky for weather. In the wheat farming communities of Kansas and Oklahoma, where the Dust Bowl years from 1930 to 1936 turned the sky black with topsoil and buried entire farmsteads under drifts of suffocating dust, the buried kettle took on an additional dimension. Families who were abandoning farms, who had decided after the third or fourth catastrophic dust storm that staying was no longer possible, buried their kettles before they left. Not to protect them from thieves in most cases, because there was nobody left in many of those communities to steal anything. They buried them because they intended to come back. Because leaving the farm did not mean surrendering the farm in their minds. The buried kettle was an act of faith, a declaration that this land still belonged to the family that had worked it, that they would return when the rains came back, that the iron they had left in the earth would be there waiting for them. Some of those families did come back, some did not, and the kettles they buried are still there, in the ground beneath what were once barn floors and are now empty fields, waiting with the patience that only iron truly possesses. The technology of the burying itself was more sophisticated than it might appear. Families who had been doing this for any length of time had worked out solutions to the practical problems that naive burial created. The most serious problem was moisture. Iron rusts. Cast iron, which is porous compared to wrought iron or steel, will rust aggressively in wet soil, and a kettle that is buried without protection in clay-heavy soil will be thoroughly corroded within a few years, destroying whatever is inside it. The solution that most families arrived at, through trial and error, or through knowledge passed down from earlier generations who had buried things for different reasons, was to coat the outside of the kettle with a mixture of lard and wood ash, which formed a primitive but surprisingly effective barrier against soil moisture. The inside was lined with dry material, burlap, old wool cloth, in some cases dried grass, before the contents were placed inside. The lid, if the kettle had one, was sealed with a mixture of beeswax and pine pitch that hardened to form a gasket that kept out both moisture and insects. Families who did not have lids improvised them from pieces of wood or flat stones, sealed with the same wax and pitch mixture. Kettles that were buried with proper technique and in well-drained soil could remain intact for decades, their contents preserved in the cool, stable environment below the frost line. Some families went further. They buried the kettle inside a larger hole that had been lined with flat stones to create a crude but effective drainage system so that groundwater would flow around rather than into the burial site. They oriented the kettle with the opening facing down, reasoning that any moisture that penetrated the lid seal would drain out rather than pool against the contents. They placed a layer of charcoal, which absorbs moisture and inhibits mold, inside the kettle before adding their valuables. These were not random improvisations. They were the product of serious practical thinking by people who could not afford to lose what they were trying to protect. Harold Beaumont opened his first buried kettle in the spring of 1935 when a neighbor named Elton Graves came to him with a proposition. Elton's farm was 3 miles east, and Elton had a problem that money could not solve because money was precisely what neither of them had. His old rendering kettle had cracked during a hard freeze, cast iron for all its virtues, is brittle in extreme cold, and a kettle that is left outside with water in it and then subjected to the kind of cold that Missouri could produce in January will sometimes simply fracture along invisible fault lines. Without a working rendering kettle, Elton could not process the 3 hogs he had ready for slaughter, and without that pork, his family was going to have a very thin winter. He had come to Harold not to borrow money but to borrow iron, specifically to ask whether Harold had a kettle he could spare or trade. Harold went to the barn. He went to the spot near old Clem's stall. He dug up the kettle. He opened it, removed the silver coins inside, and put them in his coat pocket, and he handed the kettle to Elton Graves. What he received in return was not money. It was half the pork from Elton's hog slaughter, approximately 60 pounds of cured ham, bacon and sausage that fed the Beaumont family through the rest of that winter and into the following spring. This was the barter economy that the buried iron made possible. Not a primitive system, not a step backward, but a sophisticated alternative to cash transactions that allowed rural communities to function at a high level even when their access to official currency was near zero. The 1940s brought a new dynamic to the practice of burying iron, and this new dynamic came from a direction that farming families had not anticipated: the federal government's wartime scrap metal drives. Beginning in 1942, the War Production Board launched a series of campaigns to collect scrap metal from American households and farms to support the production of military equipment. The drives were organized at the local level by civic groups, schools, county governments, and the pressure to contribute was intense because the drives were framed explicitly as patriotic duty. Families that contributed were publicly praised. Families that were perceived as holding back were, at minimum, subject to social disapproval, and in some communities to more direct pressure from neighbors and local officials who took the drives very seriously. For farming families who had spent the previous decade carefully accumulating and protecting their iron, this created an acute dilemma. The patriotism was genuine. Farming families had sons and brothers and husbands serving in the Pacific and in Europe, and nobody wanted to be seen as less than fully supportive of the war effort. But handing over the cast iron that had kept your family alive through the worst years of the Depression, to be melted down into shell casings and tank armor, felt like surrendering the last reserve you had. The compromise that many families reached was to contribute what they could publicly afford to contribute: a broken plow part, a worn-out piece of equipment that was genuinely past usefulness, while keeping the critical pieces, the kettles and the Dutch ovens, and the heavy pieces that still had real utility, quietly underground and unreported. This was not considered dishonorable within the community's own moral framework. It was considered prudent. The war would end. The hard times that had preceded it might return. And a family that had given away its iron to the scrap drive and then found itself in another depression with nothing to render lard in would have made a bad trade. The 1950s changed everything gradually, the way gradual change always works. You do not notice it happening until one day you look around and the world is entirely different from what it was. Rural electrification, which the Roosevelt administration's Rural Electrification Administration had begun pushing in 1935, had by the early 1950s reached most farming communities in the country. Electric appliances were replacing the functions that iron kettles had served. Electric washing machines meant you no longer needed to boil your laundry in an iron pot. Commercially canned and frozen foods, becoming available even in rural areas through expanding road networks and the proliferation of grocery stores, reduced the need for large-scale home food preservation. Propane stoves were replacing wood stoves, and propane burners could not accommodate the massive iron kettles that had been designed for open-fire cooking. The rendering of lard was declining as commercially produced vegetable shortening. Crisco had been around since 1911, but it became genuinely affordable and widely available only in the post-war years. replaced lard in kitchens across the country. The iron kettle was losing its utility, and as its utility declined, so did the urgency of keeping it hidden. The economic catastrophe that had made the practice necessary had receded in living memory, not forgotten, not by anyone who had actually lived through it, but softened by 15 years of relative prosperity into something that felt, to younger people who had not experienced it firsthand, more like family legend than practical warning. The daughters who had grown up watching their fathers dig holes in barn floors at dusk grew into women who understood intellectually why it had been done, but did not feel in their bones the fear that had made it necessary. Harold Beaumont died in 1959 at the age of 73. He had worked his farm to the end, though by then his son-in-law had taken over most of the heavy work. His daughters knew where the buried kettles were. His oldest daughter, Clara, had known since she was 16, but the contents had changed over the years. The silver coins had been spent during various lean patches in the 40s. The seed corn reserve had been used and not fully replenished as commercial seed supplies became more reliable. The land deed had been moved to a fireproof box inside the house when those became affordable in the late 40s. What remained in the kettles, by the time Harold died, was mostly the iron itself. The kettles sitting in their holes wrapped in their burlap and lard, not because anyone was planning to use them for barter, but because nobody had gotten around to digging them up, and because digging up a buried kettle felt somehow like closing a chapter that the family was not entirely ready to close. Clara left them there when she and her husband moved into the farmhouse in 1960. Her children, growing up on that farm in the 1960s, did not know the kettles were there. Clara did not tell them, not because she was ashamed of the practice or because she thought it was foolish. She never thought it was foolish. She had too much of her mother in her for that, but because she could not find words that would make her children understand what the world had been like when those kettles were buried. Her children had grown up with electricity and a Frigidaire and a television set and the knowledge that the grocery store in town carried everything you needed. The idea of a world where you buried your iron under the barn floor because the bank had failed, and the government might come for your gold, and your neighbor might come for your smokehouse meat in the night. That world was as remote to them as the moon. It was not until 1971, when Clara's youngest son was doing repair work on the barn floor, and his shovel hit something solid 2 feet down, that the kettle came up again. He almost threw it away. He was ready to set it aside with the other junk that accumulates in old barns over generations. It was Clara, watching from the barn door with her arms folded, who told him to bring it inside and clean it up. She sat at the kitchen table that evening and told the whole story, Harold and Ruth and the bank closing, and the cold November when the first hole was dug and the neighbor's cracked kettle and the 60 pounds of pork that had fed them through the winter of 35. Her son listened. He was 32 years old, a practical man who had never given much thought to his grandparents' depression years, and he sat at that table and felt the ground shift beneath his assumptions about the world he had grown up in. The kettle is still in that family. It sits on a shelf in the kitchen of the farmhouse, cleaned and re-seasoned and used sometimes for apple butter in October, when the family gathers the way Harold and Ruth's neighbors used to gather, stirring with a long wooden paddle over an outdoor fire. It does not look like a piece of history. It looks like a cooking pot. But everyone in that family who knows the story understands that it is not just a cooking pot, that it is a record of a particular kind of courage, the quiet, practical, undramatic courage of people who faced the worst that their world could do to them and responded not with despair, but with ingenuity, burying what they needed to survive in the cold Missouri earth and trusting that the spring would come and that what they had hidden would still be there when they needed it. Across the country, in old barns that are still standing, and in fields where barns used to stand before they fell or were torn down, there are iron kettles in the ground right now. Some have been found by metal detectors, some have been uncovered during construction, some have been revealed by erosion after floods moved topsoil and exposed what had been buried 6 inches deeper than the original surface. Most are still where they were put, in some cases 80 or 90 years ago, by hands that are long gone, belonging to families whose names may only survive in county records and cemetery headstones. They are there in the clay of Alabama and the black soil of Iowa, and the sandy ground of South Carolina and the rocky earth of Vermont. They are the physical record of a chapter in American rural life that did not make it into most history books, because the people who lived it were not the kind of people who wrote books about themselves. They were farmers. They were practical. They did what needed doing and they kept quiet about it. And they fed their families and they held on to their land. And they passed down what they knew to the next generation without fanfare or ceremony, in the dim light of a barn at dusk, with the smell of horses and hay around them, and the cold ground solid beneath their feet. That is what the iron kettle beneath the barn floor means. It is not a curiosity. It is not a treasure in the dramatic sense. It is evidence, hard, cold iron evidence, that the people who built rural America were tougher and smarter and more resourceful than anything that was done to them. They buried their iron not because they were defeated, but because they were determined. And the iron is still there to prove it. Thank you so much for watching this video all the way to the end. It truly means the world to us. If this story moved you or taught you something you did not know before, please take a moment right now to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a new episode. Leave us a like if you appreciated the history, and share this video with someone who loves the story of real American farm life. Your support is what keeps this channel going and keeps these stories alive. This video is inspired by real historical events and practices documented in the agricultural history of rural America during the 1930s through the 1970s. It does not intend to represent or offend any individual, family, community, or group. Harold Beaumont is a representative character who reflects the real experiences of hundreds of American farmers who faced situations exactly like the ones described here during this period of history. All historical facts, practices, legislation, and events referenced in this video are drawn from documented sources. The goal of this channel is always to honor, preserve, and share the authentic wisdom and resilience of the men and women who built rural America.